Hi, and welcome to the Don't Mind Me speaker series. I am so excited to be joined by co-founder and mom, Mädchen Amick.
Hello.
Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Blaise Aguirre, and you're calling in from Boston,
I
right?
am, yeah. It's rainy and ultra humid here right now, and it's been that way for a couple of days. So happy to be sitting in a comfortable room chatting with you guys. So
We love those East Coast muggy, hot summer.
no,
You hear the
no.
you hear the insects
Oh,
buzzing around.
Yeah.
we did have a thunderstorm last night, and I loved cracking the window open and hearing the thunder, seeing the lightning, hearing the rain on the roof. That was nice, but just stepping out into the soup was not as nice.
Well, we had the pleasure of experiencing that only in a small dose. We had an East Coast trip and got to meet you in person on your campus. And we were just so blown away, not only by you, and I want to get into your background and how
Hmm.
you've become one of the leading specialists in DBT and BPD, but
Hmm.
to see the campus and what you've built there is really
Hmm.
inspiring. So I guess let's start with introing yourself. How did you get into the field? And
Hmm.
specifically, what drew you to borderline personality disorder?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so I I I've always been a very sort of cognitive kind of intellectual person. I loved reading philosophy, and when I went to college, I was very, very interested in philosophy and the way that people thought about things. Um, and but uh, I thought that if I studied philosophy, I'd end up delivering pizzas for the rest of my life. And and that I didn't necessarily want to do that. No, no rub on pizza delivery people, but it was, I thought that maybe I could offer more. And I wondered about a lot of philosophical questions. When people are thinking about philosophy, don't take into account how a person's brain actually works. So that somebody might have a philosophical question, but if the brain is working in a slightly different way, the way that they see philosophy could be different. So I thought, oh, well, what about psychology? And then within psychology, I thought, but what if there are like brain structures that are actually not working, or the way that the brain is connecting at a neurological level is different from other people's. And so I decided to go to medical school to study psychiatry. Um, and during medical school, I had a dear friend who had this very strange condition called borderline personality disorder, which I didn't, completely understand. And I went to medical school in South Africa, and certainly the psychiatric training at the time was very minimal. So, we understood depression, we understood bipolar to a certain extent, schizophrenia, anxiety, but borderline personality disorder was a very, very confusing condition. And my friend made multiple suicide attempts, and it was quite tragic to me because I thought, what a wonderful human being wanting to die. And I couldn't understand it, couldn't wrap my mind around it. And then after I finished my psychiatry rotations, I decided I was definitely going to become a psychiatrist. So, I went to medical school and certainly learned how to, you know, remove an appendix and deliver babies and all the things that medical students learn. But it was with the intention of becoming a psychiatrist. And then when I came to the States, I noticed uh, that in my training, colleagues never wanted to deal with people with borderline personality disorder, and so they would just, send them to me, and I actually found them incredibly inspiring because, I mean, most of us who live don't ever question living, but if you want to die, you'll often question what is there for you to live for, and so. And at the same time that their lives were so painful. And I thought, I mean, what kind of pain must somebody go through, emotional pain, that leads them to the conclusion that they should die? And uh, and then when I looked at the statistics for hospitalized people with BPD, the research showed that there was something like 10% of people who ended up being hospitalized, who had borderline personality disorder, died by suicide. So, so there was this incredible contradiction. On the one hand, here are these like wonderful, creative, thoughtful, emotionally attuned, sensitive people who seemed so compassionate and ready to give so much of who they were. Um, uh, and on the other hand, that experience, because they couldn't manage the level of emotionality and then the interactions with society were so painful that they wanted to die. And then, trying to understand that. So I started to train in psychoanalytic therapy, which is more Freudian. That was at Boston University. That was the main form of training. And I thought it was really interesting. I mean, there are lots of very interesting ideas, but at the same time, it didn't seem to help people with borderline personality disorder. And then I had read of a great thinker, Marsha Linehan, who is a psychologist who developed dialectical behavior therapy. And I started to read her thinking about borderline personality disorder. And what she said is that people with borderline personality disorder don't intentionally act the way that they do in order to make their life more difficult or to make people upset with them. That what happened is that they did the things that they did because they didn't know how to do things differently. And that rather than blaming, rather than stigmatizing, rather than shaming people, that the idea is if they didn't have a skill set, that they should learn that skill set. So she saw BPD as a skills deficit problem. And what I loved about the skills that DBT taught are, one, it taught mindfulness, how to be present, and in being present, not how not to fret about a future that has not even happened or isn't around, or live in a past that you can't bring back. And so it taught mindfulness, being present. It taught emotion regulation skills, and so many people with mental health issues don't have the skill set to be able to regulate their emotions. Or if they do have the skill set, they're often so deep in the dysregulation that they can't access those skills. It taught interpersonal effectiveness, how to interact better with the world so that the world is less angry at you and that you have more of a chance of being effective with the people that are around you. And then distress tolerance skills. What do you do when you're in a situation where you can't solve the problem? And for many people with conditions like borderline personality disorder, when they were under tremendous amounts of distress, it actually make the situation worse than it already was. And so the distress tolerance skills, taught what to do in those moments. And I love the humanity, the compassion of the idea that the kindest thing that you could do for someone is teach them the things that they don't know. So in 2007, I opened up a dedicated treatment center that all it does is all it does, but it teaches DBT skills to young people who struggle with not only borderline personality disorder, but then lots of other conditions where they have a difficult time regulating their emotions. And so I've been at Harvard since 2000, and I opened up the unit in 2007 with some colleagues. So this is our 18th year.
Congratulations, first of all. And we were talking to you specifically because we're wanting to build our own treatment center, and we were already learning a lot from you about how to build that from the ground up. And I think people, even if you've been a part of that and know it like a bit, the amount of work that goes into it that people will never see is insane. So we're very thankful for what you do. And there's a lot of things that came up in what you said. And as we talked about when I saw you, I've been through DBT myself. And I was resistant to go into therapy, which I've talked about is kind of ironic considering we work in mental health and we're constantly advocating for people to get into treatment. And my brother has been in therapy for a long time. But I always felt like, oh, I'm fine, and I was kind of white knuckling it through life. And I went through DBT. And it was such a positive experience. And I guess one of the first questions is, I think people are more familiar with CBT. Can you describe the difference between CBT and DBT? And
Mhm.
also, can you talk a bit about, you kind of touched on it, but yes, DBT is great for borderline personality disorder, but who else could it apply to?
So, well, but I want, one thing that you said really struck me, and that is one of the things that many of the young people who come to see me and some of the older people who see me say to me is that they've been in a lot of therapy and that the therapy hasn't helped all that much. And so when I ask them what it is that they do in therapy, what they say is that they go and talk to their therapist about what's going on in their day. Now, it's wonderful to have somebody that, I mean, I suppose that you pay to go to and to listen to you. If everybody else is saying, oh my gosh, here you go again, you're starting to complain about your life and all the things that are going on. I just don't want to hear it anymore. And then you say, but I have a therapist who I can go to every single day and talk to, or once a week or whatever it is. Uh, and so when people think about therapy, they often think about therapy in that kind of way, a person that they go and talk to. But the problem with that is that talking about your problems isn't a solution to the problems. If you tell me that you don't know how to swim, and you tell me all the ways in which you can't swim, and I listen to you, and you feel like, wow, Blaise really understands why I can't swim. And then you leave my office and you say, wait a second, I still don't know how to swim. I may understand very well that you don't swim and why you can't swim, but it hasn't taught you to swim. So listening therapies might feel good, but don't actually often accomplish what the person wants out of therapy. Okay. Now, and what I liked about DBT and CBT, certainly it's the B in both of those is behavior therapy. And uh, and that changing what you do changes the brain much more powerfully than talking about what you do. So if you tell me that you don't know how to swim, and I say, I hear you, let's talk a little bit about what happened. And at the same time, I'm going to teach you the behavior of swimming. So that so I understand why you can't swim, but I'm also going to teach you swimming, because that's your goal. So, um, so, so first of all, the idea that changing your behavior changes the brain much more so than just talking. Okay, now with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the gold standard for depression as a therapy, together with medications, um, what the therapist tries to do is point out how certain ideas um, are not necessarily compatible with healthy living. So, for example, if a person keeps getting into, abusive relationships, a cognitive behavioral therapist would say, okay, what are the thoughts that you have about relationships? Who are the people that you're looking for in terms of dating? And how are we going to change your behavior to do something differently from the things that you are doing? So what they cognitive behavioral therapists, it ties thoughts to emotions and to behaviors, so that by changing your thoughts about something or by changing your behaviors about something, that there's a kind of a triangle that the way when you change thoughts, behaviors will change. When you change behaviors, emotions will change. When you change emotions, cognitions will change. And so that you can do this. And that works very, very well for depression. The problem with so let me give you an example in terms of a depression. So let's just say that you're depressed and you're staying in bed all day. And I say, look, if you change the behavior of staying in bed all day, you're going to start feeling better about yourself because you'll start moving around. You'll get more blood flow to the brain. You'll probably get something good to eat, and you'll feel a little bit better about yourself. So, for people who are in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, they would understand it and they would do it. The problem in borderline personality disorder was that when people try to apply CBT to those kinds of behaviors, it actually backfired. So if I were to say to somebody with borderline personality disorder, look, what you need to do is get out of bed and go for a jog around the block and walk your dog and call a friend. What would happen is the patient would feel invalidated by saying, this is really painful for me. What you're asking me to do is more than I can manage. And I've tried so many of those things. I've tried calling my friend. No one wants to talk to me. I've tried getting out of bed and it's, maybe I've got physical pain. Um, I've tried to eat, but I'm sick and I don't feel good about myself. And engaging with the world is really painful. So what happened is like saying, get up and go for a walk. It's like you make it sound so easy, as if it's just that easy to do. So what DBT did is it included this component of mindfulness and of acceptance. So rather than simply focusing on change, it first accepted a patient as they were. It said to a patient that given your brain biology, given your development, given who you are as a human being, given what your experiences are, it makes perfect sense that this would be difficult for you. I want to recognize how difficult it is for you. And I'm not going to judge you uh, for for not making big steps in changing something. So in other words, maybe just getting up out of bed this morning is a win. We know that you staying in bed hasn't solved your problem. And yes, getting up and going for a jog, it might be too difficult. So let's just find a middle path. Let's find a way in which, maybe I can ask for a lot, but maybe you can just do a little bit, and that's a win. And I'm not going to judge you for those small changes. So what DBT said is that we really have to understand a person's difficulty in their context and know that it makes sense for that other person. And that when people felt understood, they were much more likely to change their behavior than when they didn't. So I think so it was taking CBT and adding the element of accepting the person as they were fully, saying it makes sense that this is difficult for you. And at the same time, uh, things need to change. And what dialectics say is that opposing ideas can exist at the same time. So it is true that for the person, say, with borderline personality disorder, getting up out of bed might be difficult one day. That's one truth. A coexisting truth is that they need to do it in order for things to change. So their static nature in that moment and the need for that static nature to change, both of those exist, both are true, and both need to be held in the therapist and the patient's mind in order for progress to happen.
Well, I'm super excited because I think I'm officially in the camp of DBT.
Mhm.
I started therapy. I've gone through a couple of therapists, but one more recently, I was really feeling like the physical effects of trauma,
Mhm.
emotional trauma, and I was
Mhm.
having a really hard time emotionally regulating, and I needed to find new tools to try to figure out how to do that. And Mina suggested a therapy group. And so I started with a therapist there, and I sort of assumed I was doing CBT, but I'm now learning through this conversation that she's absolutely doing a combination because there's a lot of DBT that
Mhm.
she's doing. And I love what you were saying about living in the present. I find that I think that's so hard for so many of us, whether you have a diagnosis or not, we're all shades of gray. And the regret of the past and the worry of the future, I get caught up in those so much. And it's
Mhm.
just always a reminder to live in the present. That's all we can do right now. That's
Mhm.
all that we
Mhm.
have control of doing. So I really appreciate that. And
Mädchen, I think I have this small little Instagram, but anyway, I recently posted this, and so it's I got myself this hourglass, and so uh, everything in the bottom of the hourglass is what's happened in our past. Everything at the top is our future, and here, all the sand that's trickling through, this is our present moment. Now, if we spend our present moment thinking of everything that's happened in the past, then all we're doing is we're focusing on something that cannot change, because you cannot, until we figure out a way to turn the hourglass upside down, which we haven't been able to yet, unless you think about Benjamin Button or something like that, where you can reverse aging. Is that we're wasting this moment, spending so much time regretting a past that we cannot change, and that if we're going to focus on anything, focus on that future you. Who is the you that you want to be in a year's time, in 2 years' time? And what are the things that you need to do now in order for that to happen? And how do you spend this present moment being the most productive version of yourself? And when somebody has trauma, there's that you can spend a lot of time. That is one of the options. Spend a lot of time thinking about the way in which you were traumatized. Another thing that you can do in the present moment is do evidence-based therapies like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, written exposure therapy, narrative therapy. One of these therapies for yoga-informed trauma therapy. No, I mean trauma-informed yoga therapy rather than yoga-informed trauma. And and uh, as an evidence base to deal with what is happening either in your body, in your emotions, in your thoughts, in the present moment, rather than reliving a painful past, because all that does is keeps you stuck at the bottom of that hourglass rather than being the most healthy, effective version of yourself.
Now, is there any concept in there about learning from your past? I think maybe some of us get caught up in, well, you got to learn from your past in order to make change for the future, and that might get us a little bit stuck.
I think that the ways in which learning from the past can be helpful is, so for example, let's just say you decide you're going to go for a jog in the desert, with bare feet, and you get bitten by a rattlesnake, so then you could say, well, look, that wasn't like very smart, and like next time I'm gonna, wear boots, or go hiking somewhere else or something like that. So you can take that. The problem when there's been relational trauma, emotional trauma, is uh, is what what are the lessons that we can learn? So, for example, let's just say that someone's in an abusive relationship, and that there's some kind of red flags that show up. The person is yelling at you, or maybe some physical violence or something like that. And then you go on another date, and this new person starts yelling at you and maybe grabs you or something like that. Then you could then say, okay, I've been here before, and I'm not going down this path again. So that's one thing, but that's when it's obvious. And but sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes there's like a kind of a relational mismatch. There's a way in which people understand things differently, and it's just really, really upsetting, for you. And sometimes what I see is like people grabbing towards finding that lesson, and they spend too much time finding that lesson and saying, sometimes you might not just know unless it's obvious, and it's okay. You can self-validate. This was really painful. Um, and and maybe it's not so much that I've learned a lesson, but that maybe I learned meditation, maybe I learned yoga because of it. So maybe I can't say I learned something from that, but that something positive for me came out of that. So I just, I think that sometimes I've seen people get really stuck in trying to find like, what was the lesson that I learned? And it's not that clear, but they want something. And I'm just saying, like, don't spend too much time focusing on that if it's not obvious. And it may come to you later. Like, you don't need that in order to heal.
With that in mind, I want to talk about what treatment has been like for you, because you've been at McLean now for a while. And I wonder, because I would say even just in like the cultural perspective, borderline is a very misunderstood diagnosis, and I think it's becoming more talked about, but still isn't as popular or understood as other mental illnesses. And so for you, what has treatment looked like during your time at McLean? Has it changed? Has your perspective on things changed? Just kind of talk about like what that's looked like for you over the past however many years.
Let's just take a step back, because I think you said something that is very, very important, that borderline personality disorder is very misunderstood. Now, why is it that conditions like major depression are less or slightly better understood, maybe not completely, or anxiety, or maybe even bipolar, or maybe substance use disorders like alcoholism or something like that? Why are they better understood? And I think that the when some of the treatments are biological, like psychopharmacology, there is an incentive from the producers of medications that help for those conditions to put the word out about these conditions. So, and you'll see these in ads. Do you sometimes hear voices in your head, or your thoughts all jumbled? Do you have mood shifts that are highs and lows? Maybe you should speak to your clinician about this medication or something like that. The problem with a condition like borderline personality disorder is that there isn't a medication that treats borderline personality disorder. Certainly, a lot of people with borderline personality disorder are on medications, but that is because, like with other mental health conditions, borderline personality disorder does coexist with other conditions, some of which can be treated with medication. Now, that borderline personality disorder has the people have difficulties in regulating their relationships, regulating strong emotions that happen in the moment, regulating some of their behaviors. So you see maybe self-injury or impulsivity, regulating some of their thoughts, regulating their sense of self. And these experiences happen moment to moment, and there's no medication that has been shown to help with those experiences up until this point. So it remains somewhat mysterious. The other problem is that at times people with borderline personality disorder, when they get very frustrated, because their emotions can be so much bigger than a person without maybe a psychiatric condition, sometimes when the emotions are really big, they might be behaviors that feel aggressive. So for instance, yelling and screaming at someone, saying hurtful things, or turning that anger in towards themselves, and maybe doing some self-injurious behaviors and suicidal behaviors. And so what happens is, what happens is that people tend to judge those behaviors as bad behavior on the part of a person, rather than seeing those behaviors as something that the person doesn't know how to control. And when the attack, the verbal attack or anger, is being directed towards oneself, then it can feel very hurtful. And then the idea of judging the person as just being a bad person, sort of shows up. And often people with BPD don't want to feel that way or act that way, but they just don't know what else to do. And so what happens is this sort of behavior shows up. But most people with borderline personality disorder are suffering tremendously and aren't saying hurtful things and aren't, yelling and screaming, but they're suffering. And yeah, so as with any other condition, the manifestation of this quote unquote the worst of the behavior is the stuff that's talked about online and in video clips and stigmatizing statements from others. In the time since I've been at McLean Hospital, made famous by movies like Girl Interrupted, Susanna Kaysen was a patient here for 2 years, and she wrote the book about being here. The first thing that we were able to shift the thinking that borderline personality disorder could not be diagnosed under age 18, but there was sort of an outrageous kind of almost paradox that if you say that a person can be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder once they turn 18, then what condition do they have the day before they turn 18? So you're
Yeah.
17 years old, 364 days, and the psychiatrist says nothing to the parents. They say, I cannot diagnose your child, but wait until tomorrow and then I'll diagnose them. So it seemed pretty preposterous. The other idea is that because I've talked about DBT being a BPD being a skills deficit condition, and that DBT teaches skills, what's the downside of teaching skills very early on, as soon as you start to see these kinds of behaviors? Teach them at 14, 15, 16, even younger, and they can benefit the people, lots and lots of people. So one point is that dialectical behavior therapy skills can benefit those with BPD, but can benefit those with bipolar disorder, with depression, with anxiety, and people with no diagnosis at all. So it's a wonderful social emotional skills training approach. Um, and so one of the biggest changes was, first of all, people being more comfortable diagnosing BPD before age 18. And also, I mean, we've been fighting against the stigmatization of all mental health conditions, but in particular, in my case, borderline personality disorder. And you guys, I remember just meeting with you and talking about the stigma that you guys experienced, maybe personally, but certainly for your brother and son. Um, uh, and I think that that is true of many people with, and loved ones with mental health uh, conditions. But the irony and the tragedy is that there's not a single family anywhere in the world that isn't touched by some sort of mental health condition. So reduction of the age in terms of BPD, ongoing attempts at targeting stigma, um, and having a better understanding because of research in terms of neurobiology, in terms of effectiveness of treatments like dialectical behavior therapy, etc. So those are the biggest changes I've seen.
Is BPD hard to diagnose? And it sounds like if so, it's getting better a little bit.
Um, it used to be that, and certainly in my training, I was told that BPD was hard to diagnose. It actually seems very straightforward to me. And in fact, when I go through the criteria with people and accurately diagnose borderline personality disorder, 80% of people who get the accurate diagnosis say, thank you so much. I finally understand what's happening to me. And it's actually very stigmatizing not to give someone an accurate diagnosis. And so there are 9 criteria, and I can just very quickly go through them because uh, because when you think about them and then you think about applying them to either someone that you love or for a person themselves, and I'm not suggesting that anyone should self-diagnose or diagnose a loved one, but if these resonate, that they can certainly go to mental health professionals saying, hey, I heard this talk and some of these resonate. So the first one is frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So people with borderline personality disorder are terrified of being left or terrified of being abandoned. None of us wants to be abandoned, but there's a terror that happens for people with BPD, and then they behave in ways to prevent that from happening. So maybe constant phone calls, going to someone's house, texting someone incessantly. And the problem with those frantic efforts is that eventually for the other person, it can become pretty annoying. And then tragically, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the person says, I don't want any more of this. I'm done. I am leaving. And so that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of abandonment. Um, there are intense interpersonal relationships characterized by extremes of idealization, devaluation. And what this means is that people with BPD tend to fall very rapidly in love, in connection with others. And those of us who are emotionally sensitive might have a propensity to do that. But for people with BPD, it happens very, very quickly. And then they are intensely idealizing the other person, like this is the best person ever, like I'm going to get married to them, within like 3 hours of having met them. But then, things start to go wrong, and then there's rapid devaluation. They're terrible. I hate them. And it's a manifestation of all or nothing black and white thinking, which is quite common in people with BPD. There's an unstable sense of self or self-image, which is, this idea of who am I, constantly changing appearance, constantly changing life goals, um, uh, really grasping at an idea of like an unsettled sense of who I am and where I'm going, and finding purpose and meaning. Then there's impulsivity in two areas that are potentially self-destructive. So not just impulsivity, but just impulsivity in terms of like unthought out eating behaviors, substance use, sexual encounters, driving, spending money. So things that could really do some damage to the person. And often they're done because the person is feeling so desperate that little moments of either feeling connected or driving fast and feeling the thrill, or the thrill of a new purchase, or using a drug to avoid how they're feeling, can just feel good in the moment, but in the long run they can be pretty dangerous. Then what we see is a lot of self-destructive behavior through cutting, and even maybe suicidal thoughts and behaviors. There's different from bipolar disorder, where there's discrete episodes of extended periods of mood, either mania or depression. People with borderline personality disorder have rapidly changing emotional states, and often that has to do with what's happening between them and somebody else, or them and their own thoughts. Um, then there's three more criteria to go through. There's a um, a feeling of emptiness inside, and that's a feeling of feeling profoundly misunderstood, feeling very lonely, feeling very alone. And I think that for people with many mental health conditions, trying to explain whether it's autism or schizophrenia or bipolar or borderline, others just don't really understand. And when you're the one who's struggling with it, it can feel very lonely and very empty. Um, the eighth criteria is what is considered inappropriate anger or difficulty controlling anger. So people with BPD often experience a lot of anger and rage, and there can be verbal fights, physical fights, destruction of property, um, and sometimes even anger turned towards themselves. Now, even though it's inappropriate because the prompting event is small, typically, um, in the moment when the person's experiencing it, it can be really, really big. So, I mean, if you think about someone allergic to peanuts, you could say, well, here's just a single peanut, but that might lead to a massive reaction for that person who's allergic. So for the person with BPD, maybe even a small prompt can lead to a big reaction. In the moment, it feels big. Often they can look back and say, yes, in the big scheme of things, wasn't that big. And then finally, people with BPD, as with other mental health conditions, are often traumatized, and they have either trauma or PTSD, and then they can experience dissociation, where they themselves don't feel real, the rest of the world doesn't feel real, or they become paranoid about the way that the world interacts with them. So if you look at those criteria and you see not these criteria have persisted for a long period of time, then you can very comfortably make the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And it's not like, yes, I once had this friend and I was intense with that person, or 6 weeks ago I had a dissociative episode. It has to be there as part of your regular experience over a period of time.
It sounds like, just kind of like from an overview, it sounds like there's almost a lot of like brain chemistry imbalance in a way, I guess. And it is curious that there aren't medications that could help with that balance. Because it sounds like the behaviors are trying to, like, almost trying to grasp for some kind of like chemical hit, or maybe not being able to balance the chemical release of something. I don't know. I guess I always go to like what's tactically happening in the brain,
Mhm,
brain
mhm.
chemistry.
Yeah, it isn't so much that. What the research has shown is less about the neurotransmitters, the chemicals that you're talking about, and more about the way that um, that that things connect. So I have a little lamp here, and then there's a switch, and I can turn it on and turn it off. And so that switch is connected through a cable to the light, and there's electricity in there, and when I turn off that switch, the light goes off. And what we know about people's brains with borderline personality disorder is that the cables connecting the part of the brain that controls emotions, the limbic system, the amygdala, I mean the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the brain, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain that controls executive function and behavior, that connection is not very strong. So what happens is that you have a big, all of us get upset, but not all of us then become suicidal. So maybe there's a big upset, and the front part of the brain is supposed to relay messages that say, "Hey, slow down." Like, okay, let's just think about what's happening. That connection is underdeveloped in people with BPD, and what we see is that when they do treatments like dialectical behavior therapy, the level of activity in the limbic system starts to go down. People become calmer, and the level of brain connections in the prefrontal cortex increase, so that becomes stronger. So if you think about a car, uh, um, like a Maserati or Ferrari, but let's just say it has golf cart brakes. Those brakes aren't going to be very effective when the car's driving really fast. And so the idea is to learn how to slow down the engine and to improve the brakes on that car. And so rather than it doesn't appear to be as chemical, although there's obviously got to be some chemical elements as as um, as wiring problems in the brain.
I wonder, because I know you work a lot with adolescents, and
Mhm.
so I'm thinking about how the brain is developing when they're younger and you're able to work with them with DBT younger. Is it harder or easier to work with kids who are experiencing BPD than adults? And I'm also interested too, what's the difference between men and women and how they present BPD symptoms? Is there a
Mhm.
difference there?
Mhm. Yeah. I think that when someone is very young, what I've noticed is that when there's someone who's 13 and 14, and they're, they're going through maybe puberty, and there are a lot of hormones running around. Um, the truth is that they haven't had enough life experiences, unless life has been like really awful, to get them to see why some of the things that they're doing um, are um, are dangerous, maybe. And there's also a lot of protection from the parents. So sometimes we can get 13 and 14-year-olds to buy in, but sometimes it can be harder. Once they become older adolescents, so 17, 18, 19, um, and they've had enough repetitions of being abandoned, uh, disrupted uh, romantic relationships, um, spending money, self-injury, drug use that hasn't been helpful, um, they know that they don't want to live that way for the rest of their lives. And so they tend to more readily engage in therapy. What we see with adults who maybe haven't been diagnosed earlier on, is that a lot of the externalizing behaviors that we see in adolescence don't show up as much. So we don't tend to see people cutting themselves as much, or engaging in as much, as many sort of dangerous sexual relationships, or driving around, you know, in in fast cars, and to get kind of some of those uh, uh, surges that Mädchen was talking about. That's that chemistry that sort of thrills you. What tends to happen in older people is that gets internalized, and they tend to sort of see themselves as flawed people, as broken people. And actually, my latest book, which I called I Hate Myself, um, really tries to address a lot of that internalized self-hatred, self-criticism, self-judgment that many people with borderline personality disorder have. So you might have an adolescent with BPD and an adult with BPD, and the adolescent is going to tend to, just generally speaking, have more of these externalizing loud behaviors, whereas the adult will have same sort of thoughts and thought processes, but it'll be more turned inward, just as a general rule. That does not mean to say that you can't have adolescents with a lot of internalizing behaviors and adults with outward behaviors. Um, the difference between men and women is interesting, because in the past, what we were taught was that a BPD occurred on a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 women to every 1 man. But then in latest research, it appears that it's much closer to 50-50. Now, because men and their externalizing behaviors tend to be a little bit more aggressive. So, for instance, there might be more assaultive behavior, angry behavior, rageful behavior, and that men, unfortunately, then in those circumstances, tend to be much more involved with the law than with a mental health system. And I think that that's true of other conditions such as bipolar disorder, etc. That if say a woman is upset and yelling at her romantic partner, and maybe doing some self-injury, or maybe even grabbing the person, it's much less likely that someone is going to call the police. Whereas if a man is yelling at a woman because of their own emotional dysregulation and behaving in a very dysregulated way because of BPD, and certainly there can be more damage done if there's a lot of aggression and, bigger muscles and testosterone and all of that sort of thing. But then what happens is the police are called often, and um, uh, I was never someone for defunding the police, but I was always somebody for saying that police should be doing police things and not mental health things. And unfortunately, at a time when there aren't enough mental health services to go around, police are called to intervene without any training into conditions that are sort of mental health conditions. So that is another a situation where we can see a difference between men and women. But having said that, other than that aggression and the physicality, most of the men that we see with BPD look very, very similar to the women with BPD.
Is there an age that BPD tends to show itself more commonly? Is it similar to other mental health diagnoses where it's happening in that like adolescence to young adulthood range?
Yeah, I have not met a single adult person with BPD who didn't say that they had BPD symptoms in their adolescence. And that it's not as if like I had a perfectly fine life, and then all of a sudden I turned 18, 19, and I suddenly developed BPD. I've never ever seen a case like that. So yes, to your point, I think that soon after puberty is when we sort of see a spike in BPD diagnoses and presentation.
And is it genetic? Do we know?
Yeah, the genetics are actually pretty powerful here. 60% of people with BPD have a BPD parent. So, so it's 60%, it appears it's 60% genetic and 40% environmental.
I guess
Wow.
that makes me wonder though, is that a reflection of maybe how the relationship was with the BPD parent that could have affected their interpersonal relationships going forward?
And I think that there's no question about that, but I think that there's some people who are doing things like looking at gene expression and looking at and there does appear to be some similar genes that regulate mood, that regulate impulsivity. So no question that there can be behavior that is learned. But here's why the finding is somewhat robust, and that is that if you take twin studies where children have been separated, or maybe one stayed with the family and the other one moved apart, that it will persist even if they're not in an environment that is, distressing. So, um, so the genetic penetration is pretty strong.
I guess I want to be respectful of your time. I'm so appreciative.
I love talking to you guys, and I could be on for the rest of the day because I think they're very they're unfortunately fewer moments where people can get accurate information, where everything isn't reduced to a soundbite, where there isn't sort of a compassionate reflection, where there isn't thoughtful questions, where there isn't an agenda other than wanting to help people. So it speaks to my heart, you know.
Yeah, us too, and we really appreciate it and everything that you've done. And I guess my final question, Mom, if you have anything else too, but what do you see the future of BPD treatment and DBT looking like? And I'm coming from the space of, I just had a conversation with my brother. We posted it on our Don't Mind Me page, and we've been doing the speaker series and talking to a lot of our peers and colleagues, but a lot of the time we're talking about my brother, and so it was time to really like sit down with him and have that conversation with him too. And he's really interested in the future of bipolar disorder, for example. He's looking forward to a day potentially where there isn't bipolar anymore, or you can see it early on and be able to treat it. So I guess it's kind of a twofold question of, do you feel like the future of mental health is you can eradicate illnesses entirely, or do you
Mhm.
feel like it's continuing on the idea that everyone's brains look a little bit differently, but we'll have more humane and more preventative treatment earlier on? But what's your take on
Mhm.
the future of mental health?
Yeah, I mean, look, um, in as much as there are many things about the world today that are upsetting. Um, the truth about it is that, infant mortality is better, that health care solutions for a lot of people around the world are better, that despite the wars that we see all over the world, there's more peace in the world as a general rule. And so, yeah, there are many things that, whether it's politics, whether it's global kind of situations, that by and large, you know, things are a little bit better. Now, you can talk about climate change and other situations like that, which are really, really, for me, certainly concerning. But I think people are open to learning more and being more curious. And generally speaking, people tend to be compassionate. But I do think that the more that we understand about the brain, the more we're going to be able to tinker with it in ways um, uh, that are going to be beneficial to a person who's struggling with mental health conditions. So some of it might be some of the software that your mom was talking about, like some of the chemicals that are necessary for some things to be better, but also the connections in the brain that by modifying those connections and there's technologies like something like optogenetics is a form of in theory and it would have a therapeutic application because you can look at like single nerve cells in the brain and either turn them on or turn them off. So like, let's imagine that somebody's having a terrible flashback all the time of being abused in their childhood, and they just can't turn that off. Rather than you going in there and cutting it, like you can actually perhaps even turn that off um, uh, with light, which would be really, really interesting. Now, you want to be careful because you don't want to make everybody not afraid. You need to be able to learn from something. But are there ways of making those modifications? Are there new ideas like psychedelics, like TMS, like ketamine, and other as yet kind of unfound undiscovered, unresearched or under-researched approaches that can help. What is it about communities that don't have access to any Western mental health that they have mentally healthy people? Like what are technologies from the East? What are technologies from communities that are neither Eastern nor Western, but just like extremely rural and tribal, that they might not have like mental health conditions that are worrisome. What can we learn from them? So I think that um, uh, I can imagine that we would have a technology, maybe not in our lifetime, that will eradicate all forms of mental illness. But the other thing is this: is I think that uh, that I I don't want to pathologize everything that is um, not kind of typical for people, because I think that a lot of creativity comes from, lack of a better word, madness, from out of the box thinking. And if we say like any out of the box thinking is mental illness, well, then the Van Goghs of the world, the creative artists, the creative geniuses of the world that maybe weren't as stable as we would have liked them to be, we would have lost everything that they had to offer. So is there a way of not pathologizing uh, all expressions of difference and kind of embracing it as long as it's not dangerous to the self or to somebody else, you know? So whereas, yeah, maybe we can get rid of like some of the most uh, devastating impacts of certain ways in which the brain works. Let's not get rid of all of them.
Yeah, to take away the suffering, hopefully.
Yeah,
That you go from suffering from to living with
yeah.
and not
Hmm.
completely eradicate it. My
Hmm.
last question to
Hmm.
close out at Don't Mind Me, we're very, very dedicated to making sure that we are trying to um encourage pathways or create new pathways for people to find mental health care for all and not
Hmm.
have financial barriers get in the way of people being healthy. It's a human right,
Hmm.
I think, to be mentally healthy. Do you have any advice or ideas if somebody's wanting to search out DBT or they feel like they may have a diagnosis, but they haven't been diagnosed yet? Are there any pathways that you could suggest? I don't expect you to have all the answers, but
Hmm.
are there are there how could they try to go down that path to finding something that might be available to them?
Hmm. There's some research that shows that psychoeducation can go such a long way to uh, improving mental health outcomes. And so, if you like, let's say that some of the things that we were talking about today resonates with one of the listeners and says, you know what, I have some of those things. Okay, so let's just imagine that somebody suspects that they might have BPD. Just getting the right diagnosis already reduces the burden of confusion of like, what the heck is happening to me? So that you can say, oh, wow, okay. And then there's for a lot of people who don't have severe BPD, which is the majority of people, in the same way that people don't have severe asthma, not everyone, severe diabetes, that people have mild, maybe moderate, but they're not as severe. So maybe they have uh, um, BPD. I wrote a book called Coping with BPD, and what I do is I take 50 of the most ordinary experiences and typical experiences that people with BPD have, and then just say, okay, like here's some DBT and CBT approaches that you could use yourself. So just in that sense, I mean, there can be a lot of sort of self-help that might be useful. When it becomes more severe and more significant, finding experts who are expert in borderline personality disorder, what people are finding is that either their wait lists are very long, or that that people don't take insurance and that it's expensive to get care. One of the things that some academic centers do, such as our hospital, is that because people do need to get training, so therapists need to get training in approaches that help conditions like borderline personality disorder. They often have clinics that are low-cost clinics, and so maybe the person isn't going to get like the world-class expert, but they're going to get people who are very interested in treating the disorder, and so and then on top of it, a lot of those trainees do have those experts supervising them. So sometimes in private practice clinics, there isn't an expert that they can go to, but academic centers, like, and in the major cities, whether it's New York or Los Angeles or Boston, you can find those. And then the other thing is, I mean, a lot of my colleagues who have private practices who don't take insurance often have scholarship for people who can't afford the treatment. And so I think it's worth, calling one of these clinics that does DBT and just say, I think might have borderline personality disorder. I'd like to do DBT. Do you have scholarship or offer a sliding scale for people like myself? And all of my colleagues in private practice either have sliding scales or scholarship if they don't take insurance. So that's one thing. So I think psychoeducation, picking up the phone and then just calling a couple of clinics and saying, do you offer sliding scale? Do you have scholarship? And going to academic institutions because they'll often have training clinics. And then, of course, I'm always one for voting for people who support mental health legislative initiatives. So, yeah, mental health initiatives. So somebody's very I mean, that would be someone independent of party that if they were focusing on mental health issues, I'd be, someone I would tend to vote for. So, that you have a voice in who you elect. So,
Love that. And they can also find a lot of information by getting your books.
yeah, so I've
Oh,
written, now my 22nd book.
oh
So,
my gosh.
yeah, no,
So
it's,
where can people find your books? What's the easiest
well,
way?
I think most of them are on any of the online. I think most people these days just go online and any of the online booksellers. But I know that even when there aren't online booksellers, we all know the more typical ones. But I know that places like even like Target or
Yeah.
and other places like that now sell books. And by the way, you don't need to buy the book, but I was very pleasantly surprised that I went to my local library, and it turned out that they had my books, but they were all lent out. So
Oh,
go to, you don't have to pay for any of these books. And you can just go to your library and just ask for them, and so and most of them are around the skills of DBT, but the other part of it is the one on self-hatred, because I just it just makes me profoundly sad that people are so self-critical, and we live in a world that is already critical. You don't have to join the gang that does it to yourself.
well, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We feel very, very, very honored. It was
Likewise.
great to meet you in person and to just keep continuing this conversation.
Yeah, and thank you for the work that you do, and like you've talked about, you help a very acute population that a lot of people have turned away. So we're just very grateful that you've dedicated your life and your brain to this. So thank you for that and for all the insights today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys for having reached out. Maybe a little shout out to Julia who connected us.
Yes.
And
I call her my cis witch. She's my cis witch forever.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And I just, but just for everyone who, who dares to be brave and courageous and fight and not be intimidated by forces that you know might be ignorant and I think it also shows the interconnectedness of absolutely everything because I wouldn't have met you guys without her and I wouldn't have met her without her speaking to me and I wouldn't have met her without starting 3 East and I wouldn't have done that without wanting to study philosophy. So everything's ultimately interconnected and I think that people of big hearts and big minds and big souls ultimately can get to meet and do important things. So
We always say it takes a village, and that village is literally in your family, friends, town, state, nation, globe. Like it's
yeah,
going
there we
to
go.
take us all to change the mental health landscape. So thank you for coming and being a part of our village. We really appreciate it.
Brilliant. And we will continue. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.